So, hello and welcome to the latest webinar from NetSupport this afternoon. I am delighted, as always, to be joined by two fantastic learned guests. We've got one of our guests up in Scotland at the moment, although, as you'll tell from his accent, he's not actually from Scotland. Then we've got our other guest who is currently residing in East Anglia, but we're talking around the topic today of human flourishing. Now, this is a term which has been on people's sort of radars for quite some time now, but we felt at NetSupport it was really helpful and important to try and unpick what human flourishing actually is, what it aims to do, what it aims to be, and what that might mean for schools, both across England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, and beyond, because this is something which is impacting on schools, not just in the UK, but abroad as well. So, super delighted to be here, and thank you to Susie for saying hello in the chat. Great to have you with us. I want to bring on my first guest today. This is a gentleman who I've known for an awful long time, and one of the reasons why I invited him, I was invited to a sort of research call around human flourishing by the Foundation for Educational Development. And we were talking around a topic, and this gentleman spoke so eloquently around a topic. He's someone who's got a massive understanding and passion for accessibility in education, and someone who works for the great company Text Help, who provide lots and lots of resources to support young people and older people in accessing learning opportunities. It gives me great pleasure to welcome onto the webinar this afternoon the one and only Mr. Patrick Paddy McGrath, who is currently residing in Edinburgh. Paddy, I've even brought a special mug just for you, look, to fit in. There we go.
I love it. I can't smell the coffee from here, though, Mark, to be fair.
Oh, brilliant. Listen, welcome to the webinar, Paddy. Could you talk
Thank you.
and share a little bit about yourself and your work and how that sort of ties in with the topic today, please?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me and that wonderful welcome, as always, Mark. I really do appreciate the opportunity. For those of you who know me, and Mark's mentioned, I work for Text Help. I'm head of education for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Wonderful company to be part of because what we do there is focus very heavily on inclusion. And our tagline, I suppose, sums it up for me is education for everyone. And I've been fortunate to be in education and ed tech for now on 20 years now, the last 15 or so ed tech specifically. And through that time, Mark, I've been doubly fortunate to work particularly with pupils and students who are neurodiverse. And with working with students that are neurodiverse and providing them supports, whether it's through technology or other means, you realize quite quickly that keeping them in the rigid sort of standards of the academic system may not be the best thing for them, that we have to look at the whole pupil and the whole student. And
Mm,
actually, if you think about how you work through with those students and you work on confidence or social skills or resilience or thinking more creatively as they progress, then the whole concept of human flourishing becomes obvious that what we're doing there is working with the whole child. And that's not to dismiss the academic prowess of so many of those neurodiverse pupils and students that we work with. It is absolutely to say, look, there is more to it than just the academic pieces. And what I've been sort of working on over the last sort of 4 or 5 years is seeing that expertise and what that's brought to those students and the environment and the cultures in which they're learning in and the preparedness for life after education. And it's pretty obvious that it's clear that that is absolutely relevant to every single pupil and student all over the world, as you said earlier, to bring that concept of human flourishing there, which looks at the whole child, which looks at resilience, which looks at confidence with creativity, with all of the things we talk about, but perhaps maybe formalizing it a bit more. And I'm hoping we're going to talk about that a little bit more throughout today, Mark.
no, we absolutely are. We got well. You've seen the questions already, haven't you? So you know there's a deep and broad conversation for us to be having this afternoon. So thank you so much to you for joining us today, Paddy. Even though you've been ousted from the original location you were going to be joining us from today, but we'll save that story for another
Another
time.
day.
Another day. My second guest is Mr. Al Kingsley. Now, Al is the CEO of NetSupport, and you might think, well, why would the CEO of the company that's promoting NetSupport actually, have anything or any kind of knowledge in the area of human flourishing? Well, if you don't know Al, I mean, he was talking to me the other day about a project he's involved in involving like the Eurotunnel in Peterborough. What this gentleman doesn't get involved in and knows about isn't worth knowing. And so Al's work, I'm sure you'll tell us more about this, Al, in a second, but it is so extensive. And when it came to organizing this webinar, the one person I knew that I really wanted to have sort of feed into the conversation, given the breadth of his experience in this area and so many more, I knew that we had to get Al and his thoughts in on the conversation. So much so, and he's so busy, this has literally been on his diary for like 2.5, 3 months now as well. So, Al, how does your experience feed into this?
Well, firstly, hi, lovely to see you both. Obviously, my main reason for being here is to listen and pick up loads of great tidbits from Paddy. But I always share as being a man of a few hats. So, I'm very fortunate. I've spent 30 years in the ed tech space, educational technology development. But parallel to that, I'm chair of a multi-academy trust, 20 years involvement in academies, chair of an alternative provision academy. For the last 5 years, I've been independent chair of our Special Educational Needs and Disabilities Board across our region. I sit on the Department for Education's Advisory Board for the East of England on my third term of office in that role. And for those people that have come across me, they will soon figure out that for me, education is very much my passion, but also the context of lifelong learning. So I'm an apprenticeship ambassador, chair our employment and skills board in our region. And I think, as Paddy's alluded to, when it comes to the context of human flourishing, it's not really about age and stage, because this unlocks the potential for people right the way through their lives. And so for me, it's really important, if I take experience working and supporting alternative provision, for young people there's a very different measure of where they see their aspirations, and often they're defined by the system, not by their potential. So I'm really interested to share and learn at the same time around my experiences within the schools in my trust and across our region on some of the strategies and approaches that we've had.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Al. And thank you to you for joining us in the audience. I've already seen we've got people both in England and Scotland. Welcome to Alan Cameron from Thornhill in Scotland. To help give us a gauge on the sort of global nature of the attendees today, it'd be lovely if you could join Susie and Alan in just saying a little hello and sharing where you're from. Because I think, obviously, with the questions I've got lined up for the pair of you, you will talk about and respond within your context. But I think, because you'll be able to see the chat as well, it might be useful in your responses as well if you could try and not just contextualize it in the places and spaces that people are going to be sharing that they're from, but in a sort of a global aspect alongside how you might see things in your local context. So, jumping on to the first question, Al, you talked about all your work in the region, in and around East Anglia and Peterborough, where you're based. But I want to start by asking you really the simple question, like, what is human flourishing? And then reflecting on the ideals of human flourishing, have you found any initiatives that are impactful in fostering this atmosphere that makes or facilitates students who can see not just academically, but also helping them sort of flourish and grow as well-rounded individuals?
Goodness, yeah, I might go off on a few little rabbit holes on this part of the conversation, but I think it's a really important one. And I've been lucky. I've lived in the States and worked with American school systems and across the Middle East. And this is a common theme. This isn't something that's regionally specific. But what you do see is different twists or focuses around the context of human flourishing and what it really means. You know,
Hmm.
I try and simplify it into the sense of it's about the whole child, the whole person. It's their overall well-being and them thriving in all different settings and situations. So, you could take a view of saying, well, look, it goes above the academic achievement that often we use as our measures of success crudely in our schools, and is much more about encompassing the emotional, social, physical intellectual development, the whole being in the roundest sense. And there's an interesting thing I mentioned about those measures, and I think it's quite hopefully quite an interesting kind of way of setting the bar in terms of how our education system drives in one direction and we're trying to push in another direction around this concept of human flourishing. So you mentioned, Mark, earlier about the work that yourself, Paddy, and actually I was been involved in with the Foundation for Educational Development, and I co-chaired a work stream working with the OECD on their high-performing school systems. And very simply, we've all had this measure internationally of our high-performing school systems being a snapshot of academic achievements of 15-year-olds all around the world in league tables. And that's very much about knowledge retention. But is that really a fair measure of a successful education, a successful start in life for young people? And so the OECD took a point of going back, and actually they went back quite a long way, because they went back to Aristotle. And he originally had this documentation, or this view about flourishing as being the intrinsically desirable and ultimate end of all human beings. And it's about a whole range of different aspects, but the OECD put it down to the sense of, we really think one of the measures of successful education and human flourishing is about having adaptive problem-solving skills, ethical decision-making, the way we interact in situations with our peers, and aesthetic perception, that sense of awe and wonder, the appreciation of the things around us in the world. And although that's quite a nice one that dovetails with the idea that when we measure an effective school system, we can say, on one hand, we want to understand the skills and the knowledge young people acquire, and at the same time, the skills they acquire to interact with others and their surroundings in the most effective and engaging way. I think in the context of our conversation today, we can kind of drill down into, what does that mean for a school system, and what does a school look like that focuses around that broader kind of argument. And for me, I think it starts at the very top in terms of setting your school cultures and values, actually recognizing that you want to have an intentional focus around your resources for individualized support, so that there are pathways for every learner. Pathways is really important because it's about the breadth of resources that you make available, the courses and opportunities to suit all of your learners' needs. Within my own organization, building 2 secondary schools quite close together, something as simple as having a shared sixth form provision that allows for the breadth between different types of courses, some vocational, some the traditional pathways that would suit and develop other students' needs. Having that positive school climate, having a real focus in your school about mental and emotional well-being. I think that relates to both staff and students, to be clear. And making sure that around that, and we can probably unpick in more detail, how that feeds in to both our curriculum design and teaching practice, the way that we try and set the ethos and the environment within our schools, the way we engage with our parents and community to make sure that we have the broadest sense of inclusivity. The list goes on, but fundamentally it comes back around to, if we accept that one size doesn't fit all, how do we adapt our school system to make sure that we give every child an opportunity to shine?
Brilliant, thanks, Al. It's interesting you mentioned that word adapt and adaptive a few times ago. I've got a question linked to that for Paddy in just a second. But one of the things that struck me with what you were sharing there, Al, was this idea, I'm a governor, I'm a former school teacher and leader myself, and I know how jam-packed the curriculum is. And so I was just wondering if you had any, it's lovely to sort of think about creating those conditions for success that you mentioned there. Like, for example, the ability to have a shared repertoire offer for both sixth forms, for example. So you get that breadth of offer and things there. But for some of these things that we're trying to embed and facilitate and make available to young people, how can we find time in the curriculum for it? How are you achieving that, or how have you seen that being achieved?
Sometimes it's about how we can weave things in cross curriculum. So we can talk about things about how we develop our learners' emotional skills and their interaction with peers, that sense of how they can be nurturing and supportive towards other students in the school. There's ways that we can adapt. So a good example that often crops up, I think, in terms of a time when students often need that extra bit of nurture, is that year 6 to year 7 transition. So we provide different pathways. Some students start year 7 and have a traditional pathway. Some will go into a nurture group where in year 7 they're not necessarily accessing the full experience, but they're retained in one classroom, but they start to access the curriculum in different ways to build their confidence and their emotional resilience. And then gradually, term by term, they have a greater engagement across the whole school. I think there's the cultural side of making sure that for young people that the staff and the broader community reflect their community, the way of everyone feeling they've got a sense of place. A word I think that often crops up, which I think is very much at the heart of ambition, is to ensure that everybody has that sense of agency. And I think in terms of having confidence in a space and a child not feeling the pressures of, and there are many pressures on our children through the education system at the moment, but I think agency is probably the word that resonates most for me, that feeds into that confidence and resilience. And sometimes we start with the real simple things, don't we, about making sure that our learning spaces and our schools feel safe, supported and connected, and making sure that everybody feels that they fit in the broadest sense. I think developing social emotional skills is not something that has to be a unique curriculum subject. Staff can weave it across that in the same way as planning from the very earliest stage, EYFS onwards, to build in physical and mental health, physical well-being, obviously a core one as part of the curriculum, but that broader sense of well-being is really good. And then as children get slightly older and we move into secondary, key stage 3, key stage 4, then it can be simple ones, again, perhaps around that theme of agency, where we start to look at more effective ways, project-based learning, different ways that engage for different learning types. And I think that often is the way that we are starting to recognize that we actually need to provide the curriculum and the route to learning in different packages to suit different learner needs. And that adaptability, personalized learning all feeds into that.
Well, another fantastic answer there, Al. I mean, you've given like sort of 15 or so different examples of ways in which you could tie it in there. So lots of takeaways for our audience today. And I'm minded. I certainly didn't lead on this myself, but was heavily involved in it as someone teaching at the school. We introduced vertical tutor groups from year 7 to year 11. And so there was like every tutor group, rather than having like 30 or so children for each year, would have 5 or so from each year. And that cross-year support, when year 9 needed a bit more support for GCSE choices and what have you. Well, obviously they had support from us and careers and curriculum team and so forth and so on. But they also had year 10s in the room they could talk to, who've been through that process, and transition for year 8. So you could say, what was it like for you last year when the year 7s move up into the school? All these different things. Makes me
Peer
reflect that
support.
actually it's a really good way of supporting that flourishing without it even being in a curriculum subject. So brilliant response. Thank you so much, Al.
I am glad that you mentioned vertical tutoring, though. That's something we introduced in our school, and I don't think you can overstate the value of that peer mentoring. I think it benefits the younger children, but also the older children.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Responsibility,
What it
as
really
well
helped me
as
with is, sorry, what it really helped me with as well, Al, as a tutor, rather than having 30 children to help at key moments, it meant I only had 5, and then other peer mentoring activities could be going on around other things that were linked into those different year groups. So yeah, it was so good. Um,
if you
Clearly
think
we
many of these things,
go on.
I'm conscious we've lost Paddy briefly, so we can have a little chat around some of those themes, because actually one of the most important ones when it links to agency and that broader sense is about student voice, and the way that we co-produce, and we often have examples perhaps in our primary schools where we have digital champions,
Yeah,
but I think that those often, sometimes we lose sense of that voice in the same way when we move into secondary. And I think having broader groups, whether it's about well-being, often we have themes around environmental, we have green teams or similar focus of projects within our schools. But I think recognizing that and looking, proactively looking for opportunities to bring student voice together on the topics that we're really passionate about. And under the broader sense, I think when we think about well-being and we think about the SMH challenges that we have with our students, and sometimes just that sense of why attendance is drifting and why children don't feel that fit within the school, I think there's a lot to be learned from that, and I think that's a really important one. But I also think it's important for staff to also model some of those key things that we want to try and build on and develop in terms of that broader sense for our children as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we're getting into some pretty deep conversations here, Al. But I mean, reflecting, I mean, obviously, I've crafted these questions for us today, and you've had a chance to think about it beforehand. With the vertical tutoring, for example, that you did in one of your schools, was that something that was done by design with Human Flourishing as a target behind it, or is it an unintended sort of benefit there?
You know, I would love to say it was intentionally built around the concept of promoting human flourishing. That wasn't the driver, but we absolutely had the driver that we felt there was real value for the age groups to be able to have opportunities to provide that mentoring and support. And actually, if you are focused around this idea of every child feeling they've got a sense of place, those vertical tutoring groups also give them a sense of a support network at all ages and stages. And it's important as a part of the kind of the fabric of our schools. You know, we have houses as well, and we have vertical tutoring groups. And I think there's a place for both. But ultimately, you know,
Yeah.
this is about a community and a sense of being part of something. And I think that there's more than one way you can shape and frame that. But I think in terms of peer support, that's where the vertical tutoring really came in. And like many schools, you know, for us, it's proven hugely successful, but it also involves a little bit of shepherding and nurturing in terms of how that time at the start of the school day is used. Is it used for purpose and value, or is it simply an aggregator of attendance and nothing more?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Making the best use of that time. And again, tutor time in and of itself for the RSE, PSHE, curriculum is all really, really important.
Absolutely.
And there's so many things sort of eating into to the time for young people whilst they're in school. Paddy, welcome back.
Sorry about that. I'd like to say Taylor Swift kicked me off Wi-Fi. I'm not quite sure that was the case.
No, just the hotel room, I think, Paddy. So listen, we jumped in a bit onto the idea of adaptive expertise whilst you were away. Um, could you explain a few ideas around how schools can cultivate adaptive expertise? We spent some time thinking about sort of vertical tutoring and some other things, activities. Have you got any examples of how schools can sort of cultivate this idea of adaptive expertise for young people?
Yeah, I think I was about to just come back on something Al said actually earlier, and apologies if you talked about this, but you know, when Al started, he talked about the sort of the academic benchmarks that we tend to talk about in education. And I just wanted to kind of fast forward and think about what happens if you ask myself or Al or you, Mark, you know, what kind of employee would you like in your organization? Is your first answer going to be a first class degree from a top university? No. Is your first ask, I want them to have 9 GCSEs. No, it's not. What you're asking for in terms of skills and knowledge is, are they a well-rounded individual? Do they have initiative? Do they have resilience? Can they solve the problems of the organization or the role? How do they apply themselves? How can they work in teamwork and collaboration? I think we've got to think about that with respect to this adaptive expertise that we need to build in, because these are the lifelong skills. And Al, as ever, put it so eloquently when he talked about being a lifelong learner and having those skills there that we develop on. And adaptive expertise for me is really about having the ability to apply sort of I guess, the knowledge and the skills that you're learning day to day in a typical classroom environment to use those across multiple different situations. We all face different situations during
Mm,
our day, inside and outside of school, inside and outside of work, and understanding how we as individuals and students could potentially, I suppose, apply those the learning that we have, but apply those into the multitude of different situations that you're going to face. And that is back to Al's point about being a lifelong learner. It's about always learning as you go and always adapting. You know, you asked, I think, in the question mark, how that sort of fits into the human flourishing model. And for me, that is because having that approach and being adaptive, it really empowers individuals, and empowerment is a really big thing for me in human flourishing. Like, how do we empower every individual, every child, every student, every adult to sort of navigate the complexities of life? And I think that's really important. And the word that I would use there, which is a word I don't think we use enough, is to build up resilience. Because we all face blockers on a daily basis. Our children face it
Hmm.
in school, they'll face it in the world of work, they'll face it at home. But how do we use the skills and the expertise and the knowledge that they're picking up within the classroom environment and actually apply those to help with that resilience and kind of continue to learn and foster that? But I suppose I'm renowned for going slightly off tangent on your question, Mark. But coming back round to it, again, I'm going to point to Al on this because Al made one very interesting line there, which is basically we've got to embed this. There are things that we fundamentally understand we can't change about the classroom. There is still going to be standardized testing. There is still going to be a huge workload for our teachers. There's still going to be a requirement on CPD to learn about these things. And so if you think about the old C's, the collaboration and the creativity and those things we can embed in our curriculum and our learning. And these are not necessarily specific strategies, Mark and Al. These are things that we should be encouraging all of our education colleagues to embed. So critical thinking for me, the ability to break situations down and to understand those can be applied right across the curriculum. And if you think about how those might apply in, say, for example, Key Stage 3 is probably a prime area for this, is looking at, Al, you mentioned it, problem-based learning. What I've seen globally in terms of problem-based learning is just how enriching that can be as a project because it's meaningful, it's relevant, it's real world, it builds resilience, it breaks down algorithmically steps of problems that are there to solve. And I really am passionate about PBL, that it can make a real difference in Key Stage 3. But that also on top of that element of curiosity. How do we instill in our pupils like a culture of inquiry about always asking the questions? And actually, I think this is even more relevant now because we're all abuzz with our AI and our Gen AI things. But one of the problems of where pupils are allowed to use Gen AI is they actually don't know the questions they ask because we haven't fostered a culture of inquiry to go, this is how you ask a really good question. This is how you get to the root of the problem. This is how you foster yourself and your learning in and around that. And I think that's really important because that leads to multiple solutions and multiple paths. And therefore, we become adaptive as we go and we learn. So for me, those are two quick things. And I'll add two more just in the mix to finish off on that one for you, Mark. But you talked about sort of that learning environment. Sometimes that can be a physical learning environment, absolutely. But sometimes it could just be the ability to provide opportunity for flexibility in learning in the classroom. Mark, you and I have been, and Al as well, we've been talking about ed tech for too long to remember at this stage. We're all old men at this stage talking about ed tech. But when people say to me, Paddy, what is the one piece of advice you'd give to people about ed tech? And I said, just give kids the opportunity. Just give them the opportunity. If you have to, give them opportunity and they will grow. I think this applies in this adaptive human flourishing concept. We need to provide opportunity. But again, I understand that that's a time pressure on teachers, but all of the contexts that we can bring to that, the various contexts, and how we can approach the flexibility and the space that we learn in, I think is important. Al, you're very fortunate, being involved in your trust and looking at new school builds. Like if you look at DFE requirements for school builds, how rigid actually are they? I know in Northern Ireland, it's like it's the same school that's built, albeit it looks nicer than it was in the 1980s. But we're not adapting as we go, and we need to foster that. Some of the most creative spaces that encourage all of those things and the adaptiveness of teaching and of learning are because we've applied the spaces better. And last thing, Mark, I promise, is reflective practice on this. We kind of need to be talking more to our students and helping them understand not what they've just learned. You talked about, Mark, earlier, sort of that almost that rote learning, that like the retrieval of knowledge, but it's not about that point. It's about actually understanding what have you learned, why have you learned it, and actually how could that apply in a completely different situation. So I think those few things there, they're not about fundamentally uprooting and changing the system in any way, but they are about providing maybe a more deliberate focus on a couple of areas that we know are really, really important. And if you look at, say, the work from Michael Fullan and stuff in the 6 Cs, the other one that he brings in there is character. And I think character is so important because character for me is the big wrapper around all of those things that we do. We develop those as educators natively. That's what we build in our classrooms. but I think we've got to start focusing a little bit more on these skills and how to use the learning for greater advantage. You'd be glad I joined back now, Mark. I've just taken up 30 minutes of your webinar.
I'm just gonna have to respond on that because there's a few points you raised there that I think are really important. That sense of opportunity takes me all the way back to thinking about Sugata Mitra's project with the hole in the wall, with providing a computer to children and just leaving them and letting them expand. But I absolutely, there's so many things that resonate there, which I think are really kind of important. You know, we often talk about that sense of where are we heading? Well, ultimately, you know, I think the big measure we think about when we're thinking about opportunity in the whole child is that education is often actually driven by what's happening in the world outside and the workplace and adult expectations. And I often refer to those soft skills. Many of the things you've alluded to, Paddy, is now being the power skills, the things that really differentiate. And as part of the work that was being done by the OECD, there was a report that was shared by the Ministry of Education in Finland, and I had to grab it and advance this thing because they actually asked the question of AI, in this case ChatGPT, to create a short philosophical statement about human skills with the advent of AI. And the summary that came back really resonates with many of the things you've just said. You know, in the age of artificial intelligence, the most vital human skill is not in competing with machines, but in mastering the art of unscripted creativity, a dance of innovation and imagination that transcends the algorithms. It gets a bit flowery, but fundamentally, the more we have digital and technology, the more the value is on those most human skills, whether it's resilience, communication skills, the critical thinking, all the things that you've alluded to there.
Ladies and gentlemen, Al Kingsley and Paddy McGrath. Fantastic, both of you. I mean, how can I unpick all of that and lead it on to the next question? I don't know. But one thing that I was sort of thinking about through all of that, my eldest son, who you'll both know, he's in year 10, and he's doing maths statistics GCSE a year early. And the thing that he's finding really difficult with that is the fact that it's not actual, 2 + 2 maths. It's about applying the maths to real life situations, real life problems. And lots of the things you're talking about, both of you, really, it's his ability to bring in lots of sort of those skills that you're talking about, really divergent thinking, the ability to do things and respond in ways which, things like AI can't. Sure, there are great ed tech tools. I'm minded of one that's just been pulled by Microsoft called Flip. A person who's got a similar role to me said the best thing about Flip is it brings the child at the back of the classroom to the front. So every child can have their voice and be heard within the space and do all the rest of it. But this idea that children can pull from different disciplines in order to, because you mentioned it, I think, Paddy, about, in primary, children get to experience things, problem-based learning opportunities right across the board, and they don't necessarily just sort of sit there and do geography or do maths or do things are cross-disciplinary. But in secondary, subjects are very much within their silos, and so that ability to sort of bring these things together so that you can apply these skills in multiple situations is kind of lost a little bit. So that idea around the verticality, the peer mentoring, supporting each other, divergent thinking, all the things that you've both been pulling through there, those power skills, as you call them as well, Al, are absolutely fantastic.
But
Thank
I think
you very
Mark,
much.
just you touched on something there that's almost a bit of a raw nerve for me, in that one of the challenges that I've had throughout my career is, with all due respect to everybody listening, is transition. And it's exactly that. And I see it more, and I don't want to sort of go off on a tangent on digital skills, but it's a good example of skills based in general, where we look at the level of those year 6, it's year 7 in Northern Ireland, but same age group. So
Yep.
year 6, year 7, moving into secondary phase and realizing just how far we're pushing those soft skills and those digital skills all the way back again, when how much we've actually managed as a primary sector to achieve at that very point. And you're also mentioning your eldest, Mark, and my eldest. Just to finish off on the soft skills bit, we're fortunate in Northern Ireland that we're not actually necessarily tied to a very local primary school. So we can almost do a tour of primary schools and go, I like that one. So there's open days where you can go and visit and go, I think my child would fit here. And I remember not understanding how academic or not my daughter would be, any challenges she may have. But I remember at 4 years of age doing those tours. And I remember going to a very nice school, and the school got up and said, we can guarantee academic prowess for your kid. And I went, "Mm." I went to a school down the road, and the headmaster, as it was then, got up in a very small room in a very sort of stingy assembly hall and said, I cannot guarantee any academic excellence from your child. What I can guarantee you is we will try our absolute best to make them confident and rounded individuals. And I turned him away at that point. I went, this is school. And that's all he had to say. And I still hold on to that nowadays, that kind of rounded bit is fundamentally the most important thing.
I don't disagree, Paddy. I think that's such an important thing, and what we see, again, sweepingly generalistic here, but such great work is done in primary that is then just lost when children go into what is often an exam factory. It's sort of key stages 3 and 4, and I recognise it is different in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Say very very similar in Wales. But say some of the work I've been doing with some schools at the moment is thinking about transition and those skills. I'm working with a school not too far from where you're sitting right now, Paddy, which is a through school. And part of the work is making sure that the great work that's done in terms of learning how to apply digital skills in the primary ages does transition and move through. So there isn't a disconnect between what they learn in the younger ages through to what they're learning in S1 upwards and what have you. So it is super important. I'm mindful of time. The three of us, we could turn this into a 5-hour webinar chatting on. I wanted to sort of just touch quickly, and feel free either of you to dive in on this one. Al, you mentioned this idea about aesthetic appreciation earlier. How important is that, do you think? And how does it link, dive deeper into it a bit further? How does it link into human flourishing? And, what can teachers do practically to integrate this sort of thing? Because, if it's the ability to appreciate the awe and wonder in the world. I mean, we talk about children losing things from primary to secondary. Curiosity is one of those things, isn't it? Right. So, how can we keep the fire burning on that sort of thing?
Well, I think part of it comes back to Paddy's school selection in many ways. It's about where are our priorities. The aesthetic perception bit, if I take it from the OECD's kind of definition, was about what they refer to it as a sensitivity of what's beautiful. And the best example is, why do we appreciate a beautiful sunset or a work of art or a piece of music? How does it resonate with us? And so it's about building a sense of empathy and compassion and kind of perspectives that allow, I believe, for you to both express your own personality, but also get a sense of what resonates with you and the wider world. And I suppose for me, it comes back to that sense of, are we curating the human being, or are we curating a set of knowledge that's been retained? And some of these things get quite sensitive, because the simple answer for me is, my perfect school is one that doesn't worry about the league tables, make sure that there's a pathway and there's different courses and qualifications to meet all of our learners' needs. And we don't worry about how many of our children we put on the EBAC, because we don't want to put children in for things they're likely to fail for. And if I take it from an alternative provision perspective, we know that actually some of those things that employers want most, those human skills, those power skills, mean that actually some children who perhaps don't perform through the traditional academic pathway still have huge amounts to offer. And what we want to do is give every child an opportunity to succeed, whether it's in the arts, whether it's in the sports, whether it's in whatever the subject may be. And I think understanding that sense of, it's about providing an opportunity for everyone to find their skills, the things that really resonate with them. We as a within our trust, we made a decision. We have an all-through provision. I believe all-through provision is not just about sequencing in terms of curriculum and not wasting that transition year, making sure that it's one that's seamless. But again, it's also about avoiding some of the anxiety, social emotional challenges of moving out of the comfort zone of primary into a secondary phase, and building in those opportunities in the years before. That building up the road is not a scary place, but it's a place you've visited frequently, and it's a place where teachers who are specialists in different subjects are familiar faces within the primary setting. It's about proactively weaving in to make sure that you can mitigate and minimize some of those challenges early on, and I think that for me is kind of the core. Obviously, at the early years, lots of our conversation is about, well, what are we shaping in our, in the case of one of our schools is an infant school, and much of the framework there is about play-based learning, but actually it's much broader than that. It's about how much are we putting the pressure on our learners based around those, the SATs, the phonics assessments, and how much are we providing children an opportunity to discover and play in different ways and acquire their love, their passion for learning.
Yeah, can I maybe just add to that? On the aesthetic side, Mark,
Yeah, absolutely.
suppose there's two things that jump in at me, and that's about enrichment, and enrichment in the truest sense of the knowledge and the awareness that you have of the world, and most importantly the wider world. And that, obviously, Al's touched on it, includes arts, it includes literature, it includes all these rich things that we do endeavor to, of course, put in place across our curriculum. But the more we can expose our pupils to that, I do feel the better. And I mean, that for me always broadens your perspective. Most of us, as we went through, and maybe we took years out, and our work took us in different places around the world, imagine how much we learnt and grew when we started to travel and see other cultures and see other things and experience things and go to more art galleries. These are things that we learn. And there was a project recently, which I'm going to touch on, which completely just blew me away in terms of this. And for me, it kind of summed up what could be done if we apply ourselves. And this is a project I got together. I was fortunate enough to be in South Africa a couple of weeks ago, and I was working with some educators from the US. One of them in particular, a gentleman called Kern Kelly. And Kern is responsible for ostensibly STEM in a district in the US. And Kern and I were sitting, as we do, having a beer, and he said, I need to talk to you about this project. And the project that they had a high school to encourage pupils through this aesthetic piece. Behind the high school, they were, as happens in the US, they were donated an area of forestry, right? It just happened to border on. So the STEM project revolved around the children who would effectively be, I suppose, our key stage 4 kind of GCSE level, going in and using outdoor spaces to find a tree, right? Now, bear with me on this. To find a tree, they picked their tree. And you know what the 6-month project was? It was to bring their tree back to school. And they made, by the end of the 6 months, their own electric guitar. And it was the most fascinating project to watch. Why? Because they were outdoor, they were appreciating nature, they were understanding the sustainability of all around that. Where does it come from? It's like we all buy our chicken from Tesco's. Well, not all of us from Tesco's, but we all buy it from a supermarket. The kids don't really have an appreciation where that started off. But the same is true of a guitar. So that was sustainability, that was outdoor play, that was an appreciation of nature, the cycle of life. They then used technology tools to produce this. And what, of course, did the kids do? The kids got to the end of the project and they wanted to take music lessons and learn the appreciation of music because they built this beautiful guitar. The art had went into the guitar. So, like, in terms of human flourishing, for me, it was one of those areas that just kind of wrapped up all of those individual facets. Nobody has a forest behind their school that they can start to cut trees down. I mean, and that's not the point here, but the point is we can weave elements of all of those things into the learning that we put in place. And a last piece on that, I suppose, is Al, you and I are very fortunate, and you too, Mark, I know as well, in that we do get to work with an awful lot of international schools. And the beauty of international schools, aside from, people argue they're very well financed and all of those things, we all know the reality of that. But the beauty of international schools for me, apart from being all through and having that continuity, is the rich culture within those schools. And it's the mutual respect of all of the others around, that you are constantly exposed to other languages, other perspectives, other traditions, all of those things. And that is about empathizing and understanding your peers, but it's also about exposing you to the wider you and understanding more about the world and making a rounder individual as we go.
It really is, yeah, Paddy. And it leads me on quite nicely to my next question about emotional intelligence. Considering sort of current research in psychology and neuroscience, what you've done there is you've suggested one strategy, which we see a lot in international schools, for how you can actually embed that sort of emotional intelligence and mindfulness about cultural awareness and all these different things But have you got any other sort of strategies that schools could maybe adopt that don't have this whole maybe through approach? We've got a chat in the audience from Alan who sort of recognised some of the things that I was talking about with his through school work, where he's talking about, he thinks Alan shares, I think it would be good to get more secondary teachers working in upper stages of primary and primary teachers in lower stages of secondary. Completely agree. Are there any other strategies, Paddy, do you think, that might help support this idea of more emotional intelligence and awareness and cultural awareness for young people and for teachers as well, perhaps?
Yeah, and I think it comes back down to something very fundamental, which thankfully as a society we've been getting better at. And I do think it's a post-COVID acceleration of this, which is people willing to talk about their emotional well-being and their emotional health. And I think what we need to be proactive about doing is looking at how we articulate and work with all of the pupils and students that we work with, and encouraging them to be open and to talk and develop that kind of, I suppose, that vocabulary and language of understanding how do you feel and how do others feel and empathizing with that. But I think that's very much a work in progress. We're at a point now where we're encouraging people to talk about mental health and wellness and well-being. How do we distill that into our classrooms and make it a common piece of the curriculum where we end up talking about this and being very open about it? But I think what's challenging about that is none of us at this point, even at our age, don't necessarily have the vocabulary and the words to describe how we're feeling and how we're approaching certain emotional situations. So I think it behooves us as an education system to figure out, what does that vocabulary look like? How do we articulate
Mm.
how we're feeling and how do we explain that? Maybe that's through some mindfulness, maybe it's through, things like effective strategies I've seen in terms of role play and a little bit more drama sort of in the situation, where people can almost, and students can be a little bit more freer of being themselves and be able to almost play it out third person to develop that vocabulary and that language and understand how they can talk. But talking, I think, is the most important part of that. But I don't think we just have the words quite yet, and we have to really develop that vocabulary, because there's so much goes around that, your social awareness and how you interact with others, and how people respond to you, and how you might make decisions in those bases. I think for me all stem from a recognition of, okay, what's going on in my life, and how am I feeling right now, and how can I develop that into something that's meaningful and positive to me and the people around me.
Yeah, I listened to Jamie Bartlett's Diary of a CEO podcast recently, episode with but bear with me, Jimmy Carr, and they were
Me too.
talking about
Best
toxic
episode ever, Mark. Yeah, yeah.
toxic male masculinity, right? Thank goodness you've seen it as well, because they say you mentioned those two names together, and you might think it's going down a road the wrong way, but it was brilliant. And one thing that sticks in my mind, Jimmy Carr was talking about, when he was a child, you'd ask a 14-year-old to do your babysitting. Nowadays, you need a babysitter for your 14-year-old.
Yeah.
What has happened between then and now? And it's the role models, so the role playing idea you shared there, Paddy, is absolutely spot on. Please do check out that episode. Believe me, it's an absolute cracker.
Fabulous. Yeah.
I'm mindful of our time, and I do like to keep a tight ship. So I'm going to jump forward a little bit for a question for both of you, about because all these questions are really easy for you both, right? But balancing the dual aims of academic excellence and nurturing personal growth and happiness. Are these mutually exclusive things, or can they work in tandem? Al, I'm mindful that you haven't spoken in a little while, which is uncharacteristic. So, have you got any thoughts on whether those things are mutually exclusive or whether they can work in tandem?
I think the simple answer is yes, they can work in tandem. I think there is, the first thing I would always say is, if we're thinking about, we've got our magic wands here now and we're thinking bigger picture, we kind of have to redefine what we mean by academic excellence. We're pre-programmed down one pathway of measuring based on the traditional curriculum measures, and actually there are much broader ways we could focus on, not just the traditional kind of scores and grades, but much more about people's social emotional skills, their creativity, their critical thinking, the things we've already talked about. I think we can do more about celebrating that kind of richness that's been talked about, diverse talents. Perhaps we should think in many schools, and I think it's already happening actually, which is broadening that sense of achievement and awards that's beyond the traditional and moving to more about the arts and leadership and community contribution and that mentoring that goes on, as we talk about in our vertical tutoring. There's a lot that comes down to we can strive for academic excellence, even if we redefine that in some shape, and at the same time have very much a focus in our schools about having that kind of culture of nurture, whether it's about encouraging how we foster positive relationships, I guess at one level, how we promote well-being, how we make sure it's a conversation that's comfortable to talk about, that it doesn't come with the preconception of judgment, you know. And I think talking about mental health, talking about well-being, those strands we've alluded to, I think are really important as part of our sort of social emotional learning that weave into it. The one that we touched on right at the beginning, I think is really important, is always looking at every age and stage about how we can engage more student voice. I think recognizing the more we capture student voice, back to that agency sense, but also about understanding, you know, it's really key. And then when it comes to teaching and learning, you know, and there are plenty of people who can jump onto this conversation who are far better qualified than me. But I think we need to recognize that sometimes, and it's happening, and we see some fantastic examples, but thinking about more student-centered approaches to how we actually deliver our teaching and learning, thinking about the different ways we can engage different learners. We've talked about the problem solving, different ways we can do active learning, collaboration. There is that sense that sometimes that traditional space that Paddy rightly commented on, if you're like me and you've been and built a few free schools in this country as part of your academy, you're working to a very defined footprint. But there's still opportunities to create different spaces. We're seeing that the education landscape's changing. You know, there are some children that feel that the learning space isn't right, and they're learning either in a hybrid sense or online. And maybe that's right for and works for some, but we also see some really innovative spaces being created by schools, which is a much more free flowing and open, in the same way as we might do in that early years, year one kind of free flow learning approach. That differentiating the way that we actually deliver our teaching and learning, I think that's really powerful. There's some great stuff on that. And maybe that one that's already been touched on, you know, growth mindset, actually fostering and developing that growth mindset, I think ties in with it. You know, and the last one I'll say, because I pick up a lot in America, particularly with school districts and so on, is these journeys have to involve engaging families and communities. The sense of actually building that ethos and culture and enriching that personal growth is not something you can do without parental and community engagement. And we naturally have that challenge, which is we have some degree of engagement at the school gate in our primary years with pick up and drop off, and at secondary it dissipates. So looking at ways to foster greater engagement, to support that, I think is really important. And some schools flip that round, and actually the power of the community can be a really powerful tool in supporting the school on its mission.
I think
Yeah, that holistic. Sorry for jumping in, Paddy. I'm just mindful of time, if that's okay. That holistic approach is super important. That triangulation, we know from research from Hattie, triangulation of support from child and school and home is absolutely key. But I wanted that diet can be seen as being a bit of an obstacle, can't it, Al? You know, in that, you know, if you don't have that triangulation, if you don't have that communication with parents and building those relationships, which are also important, it could be an obstacle. Could you both quickly just share one sort of strategy beyond what we've already discussed on how some of these obstacles to embedding human flourishing could be overcome? Paddy, if you've got one. Sorry
Yeah,
for interrupting you there, buddy.
no, but actually it fits perfectly into what I was going to say, actually, Mark, which was
Perfect.
I'll talk very well there about, you know, the wider stakeholders, you know, and community and parents. But I think one thing that's gone a little bit unnoticed in this webinar, and we can't let it go by, is what we need to do to support our educators in all of this. What do we need to do in terms of professional development and culture and a mindset there? Because mindset is a big challenge. The workload is a big challenge. But what can we actually do to be deliberate about these things? And that would be my kind of takeaway. How do we be deliberate about human flourishing? We, I think, as educators, collectively strive for inclusive classrooms, for supportive classrooms where our students feel safe. I think that 99.999% of educators would all say that we strive to do that, I would hope. But we need to be more deliberate about human flourishing side. And the barrier for me is, how do we help support our educators in the training and the knowledge that they need beyond this? All of us on this call can lobby for policy change we should be doing that. That's a long, slow boat. But short term, we need to work together with our teaching community and try and do exactly what Al said at the very start, which is weave things in across the curriculum. This does not have to be transformative overnight. This can be done and started now, and it is done well in various pockets around the world, including here in the UK. But we need to be deliberate about it, and we need to start it now, I think is my kind of takeaway from this, Mark, for sure, because there will be resistance to this. There are standardized tests. There are constraints on budget and resources and time and all the things, but there are many elements of this we can all do now if we support our educators across the 4 nations.
Yeah, completely agree there, Paddy. Thank you. Al,
So,
any obstacles?
To wrap it up, let me follow on a similar theme, because I think Paddy's point on obstacles is really important, and this is something which takes courage given the pressures on our school systems, but I think it's incumbent on leaders at all levels within the school systems to redefine our measures of success and remove the pressures we put in terms of those summative tests and grades that we put, and the pressures we put on our teachers. One of the biggest challenges we have, if we want to have an environment that promotes human flourishing, is we need to have consistency, and we need to have staff in the building, and that starts with recruitment and retention. The fundamentals of that are about people who are feeling that they're valued and trusted, and most importantly, have a sense of autonomy. So that the natural persuasion to put lots of processes and rules in place and more policies actually thwarts empowering the educator to respond to the individual needs of the child and not feel that there is a sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. And that's the courage of a school saying, right now, our priority is to get our learners in a place where they're most inspired and feel able to learn. And if that means we take a hit on something on an academic league table, so be it, because that's not the be all and end all. And I kind of thought, as a wrap up, I saw a lovely quote, which was just a reminder, which is sometimes the most brilliant and intelligent students don't shine on standardized tests because they don't have standardized minds. So we have to have the courage and conviction to say, we don't want to be standardized. We're happy to be bold and be different in our schools and support our educators so they feel empowered to do what they feel is most nourishing and nurturing for their children.
Absolutely, and a great point to sort of start to wrap things up on there, Al. Thank you, because academics is one way for one sort of child to excel, but it could be through a music program, it could be through a literacy program, it could be success is success in many different ways. And what a lovely quote to sort of start to wrap things up on there. So thank you to yourself, Al. Thank you to you, Paddy, for joining us. Please do check back the show notes. We'll be in touch with more details because you'll have subscribed to join us on this particular webinar. And please do visit netsupportsoftware.com/education-webinars to not just sign up for that next webinar, but you can go back and have a look at previous episodes. Some of them looking at using Google tools and Chromebooks with the likes of Abid Patel. He's joining you over at ISTE, isn't he, Al? Jen Laban, Megan Alfano. We've got Making the Most of Your Budget with EdTech with Dave Leonard, the IT badger himself, and Mr. Ollie Lewis. We've got things around diversity, equity, and inclusivity in education with Victoria Thompson and Yaritza Villalba. Abid was back again with Gary Henderson looking at cybersecurity. We've got so many fantastic webinars there, particularly AI in education, the two there with Russ Perlman and Rochelle Dene-Poth, and a different one we had with James Donnelly and Emma Darcy. There's so many resources there for you to check out. So please do visit netsupportsoftware.com/education-webinars. We can access all of that great PD completely for free. Thank you again, Paddy, for joining us. Have a safe trip back. Hopefully you won't get caught up with the Taylor Swift entourage too much. Al, good luck with signing up for your next Neil Diamond's concert. Thank you for sharing your insights today. Thank you to you, Rachel Coulthart, Susie Nyman, Alan Cameron, so forth and so on, for joining us today as well. And we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar here from NetSupport. Thanks for joining us. Take care, everybody.